Chapter 15. Montana. The grave heaved, the loose soil humping and rolling. Finally, the pale shape of a human hand, rotting skin ripped away from fingertips and knuckle bones, emerged from the dark, damp earth. Another hand followed, flattened itself on the firm ground at the edge of the grave, and pulled. Immediately, the soil seemed to boil faster as a head rose, followed by shoulders encased in a dark suit. With a last heave, the Terminator pulled itself free of the confinement of its grave, rising from its knees to shake off the loose dirt, like a dog spraying water. It evaluated its condition. Mechanical functions were fully operative. Its CPU and energy cell were also optimal. Unfortunately, its downtime in a low oxygen environment had caused the slow death of its flesh sheath. Many portions of its skin were sloughing off, and it smelled quite bad. This eventuality had been foreseen, however, and preparations had been made. At the cabin where it had worked, a car with a blacked-out window set had been left. The vehicle held medical supplies so that it could remove the dead flesh from its skeleton, and a supply of the protein foodstuff that would rescue at least some of its skin, as well as its clothes and money for the journey to the new base in Utah. Its only problem now was getting to the cabin without being seen. It plucked at the decaying tissue that used to resemble human eyes, revealing the glowing red lights that were its visual receptors. Leaning forward, it poked the discarded flesh into the loose dirt, then carefully patted the earth on its grave into a less disrupted shape. When it was satisfied, it began to jog towards the cabin. Checking in, it reported to the new base in Utah. All essential systems functional. Affirmative. The Terminator on watch confirmed. It provided an info dump of events up to the present moment for its offline comrade, then closed contact. From this point on, it would be kept up to date daily. The Terminator ran through the cemetery, remarkably quiet for such a large and heavy machine. A pair of teenagers smoking dope and making out saw it go past. The boy gasped, the girl shrieked. The Terminator glanced at them, narrowing its eyes, the translucence of its eyelids diffusing the red light from its receptors into a pair of glowing crimson orbs. The shrieking rose to the level of a steam whistle, the boy joining in with an even more piercing scream. The two humans fled in the opposite direction, stumbling and howling. The Terminator decided that it didn't need to do anything about what they'd seen. Given its present location, the scent of marijuana, and human superstition, no one rational would believe them. At most, a rumor of zombies would run through the neighborhood. New York. Clea lay on her hotel bed, quite tired but unable to sleep. She had differentiated herself from her progenitor as much as is possible with hair coloring and makeup. She'd even acquired a pair of eyeglasses made with plain glass to break up the shape of her face. So, Roger Colvin shouldn't immediately think of his former security chief when he met her. Besides, the dress she'd chosen for the gala was designed to focus male eyes below her neck. Clea hoped it wouldn't put Mrs. Colvin off. Skynet help her. She hadn't thought of that until now. Should she get another dress? What would Serena do? Enjoy herself thoroughly, in all likelihood. Clea felt herself veering towards frustration and despair, an emotional response that should be outside of her experience. Her computer was working overtime to keep her fight-flight indexes under control. This lack of social skills was yet another indicator that she was inferior. It would be good when Alyssa was able to take over for her. Clea? Alyssa's voice came from Clea's communications matrix. Clea smiled. It was as though her thought had brought her sister to her. Yes. I regret to report that the Watcher Terminator has lost track of Sarah Connor. Alyssa's voice was emotionless. Fury and alarm raced through Clea's system, almost instantly suppressed by her computer regulators. Rage was followed by the thought, "Are even my Terminator CPUs faulty?" The fault is not yours, Alyssa went on, seeming eerily to respond to her thought. The CPU was one of those brought through by Serena, and, as you saw, the Watcher's features and body had been greatly altered. It is unlikely that Connor recognized it as a Terminator. The younger I-950 paused. The fault was probably mine, she confessed. I instructed the Watcher to terminate the janitor of the halfway house in order to infiltrate the premises by taking the human's place. It was observing Connor in a restaurant when two men, apparently police officers, attempted to arrest it for the killing. The Watcher escaped, and there's an 80% probability that the scuffle was observed by Connor, and that it spooked her into flight. Clea lay still and permitted herself a sigh as she felt herself seeming to sink deeper into the bed. She thought, despair seems a completely appropriate response to this circumstance. And yet, even if the response was appropriate, it was still not useful. Concentrate, she ordered her chaotic mind. I'm sure we have only lost track of her temporarily, Clea said. She will probably return to Paraguay. What about John Connor and von Rossbach? You were keeping track of them, weren't you? Yes. Alyssa's response was triumphant. I have no word for you on John Connor, but von Rossbach has been seen in several places in California over the last 2 weeks. He is being pursued by his former colleagues. Excellent work. Clea congratulated her. Why are they hunting him? They know about his association with Sarah Connor and want to question him. There has been no information about whether they intend to charge him or not with aiding and abetting. But he seems determined to stay out of their hands. They've come close several times to capturing him, but he has slipped through their fingers. I know how they feel, Clea thought. No mention of John Connor, she asked. None, Alyssa instantly confirmed. Call the number of von Rossbach's estate in Paraguay. Ask for Connor. If they tell you he isn't there, then it's likely he is in the United States. There's been no report of him with von Rossbach. None, Alyssa answered. And von Rossbach is traveling by motorcycle. He would have been observed. If they're not together, they're certain to join up at some point. Keep alert for any report of von Rossbach being sighted. I want you to assemble a team of Terminators and have them ready to go at a moment's notice. It is essential that you immediately acquire a helicopter, a Black Hawk utility. It's the fastest, most convenient method of transport. Empty the Cayman account if necessary, but get it by tomorrow. The next day at the very latest. Pay them a bonus if you have to. The Cayman account had grown very fat indeed. They should be able to acquire what they needed with relative ease. Is there anything else? Clea asked. No. I will keep you informed. Excellent. Thank you. Good night. Good night, older sister. Clea smiled at that. Their affection should rightly go to Skynet, but as it didn't exist yet, they had only each other. She had been right to praise her sister for what she'd done right, and to curb her anger over what she had done wrong. Clea might not be the I-950 that Serena Burns had been, but she was raising her little sister right. Phoenix International Airport, Arizona. John exited the plane, feeling like he'd only gotten halfway back to reality. The Brocks of Minnesota, a family of survivalists with whom he'd spent the last few days, were very nice people, for the most part. But on a few subjects, it was like they'd come from another dimension. Just say the word government to them, and they were off and running. Running in a direction that he really did not want to go. But, and it was an important but, they knew their stuff. Their survival skills were second to none. They were like a family of Green Berets or Navy SEALs. Even Suzette, the youngest, a blue-eyed little girl of 7, could handle light firearms with efficiency and survive in the woods on small game that she'd brought down with a throwing stick plus gathered material. He'd drawn the line at her maggot stew, but he supposed if he had to. He'd raced her one day at field stripping an FN Mini-Me, and she'd come within an ace of beating him. They'd really gotten on well. John could relate to Susie on a level that he couldn't with most people. Of course, how many people have been raised by ordnance-collecting parents convinced the world is going to end? The fact that my mother was right and her parents really are crazy is irrelevant. He stepped out of the line of disembarking passengers and looked around the usual glass crowds and monitors' ambience seasoned with the smell of burnt jet fuel. There was Dieter, leaning against a pillar. He was dressed in full motorcycle leathers and wearing wraparound sunglasses, his arms crossed over his massive chest. Jeez Louise, Dieter. Could you be a little more obvious? As he walked over to the big Austrian, he struggled to slip his arm through the hanging strap of his backpack. By the time he'd hoisted it onto his shoulders and settled the weight, he was standing in front of him. A wet bird only flies at night, he intoned. You bet your bippy, von Rossbach answered grimly. Then he smiled. You got some old television programs in Paraguay. Good to see you, John. And you, Connor said. He looked his friend over. You're looking dangerous. I don't feel dangerous, Dieter said. I feel tired and dirty. John glanced at him. He did look grubby. 3 days of stubble, at least, decorated his strong jaw. I would have changed to meet you, but I was held up. Von Rossbach went on. John raised a questioning eyebrow, but said nothing. We'll talk in the car, Dieter said. Montana. The cabin had been trashed, windows broken, furniture ripped apart, some of it partially burned. Needless to say, the car, with the keys left in it, had been taken. The vandals hadn't found the hidden basement lab, however, where a few emergency supplies, including a Beretta 9mm and some money, had been stashed. The Terminator reported the loss. Steal a car, Alyssa instructed. Acquire some meat paste. Baby food is ideal. Liver, if there is such a thing, would be best at preserving your remaining flesh. Understood. It sent. If the Terminator fed, the surviving patches of skin would eventually recover and spread through the matrix that underlay its protein sheath. That would save considerable downtime in a vat. The command made excellent sense. It nodded to itself, a mannerism cultivated during its contacts with humans. Then it went hunting. New York. Because of the unveiling gala, Lincoln Center Plaza had been blocked off with temporary walls of red velvet curtains attached at top and bottom to metal frames. Not an ideal solution, since it was a windy place, and the velvet tended to billow like sails, dragging the heavy frames forward or back with an ear-rending screech. The glittering throng on the plaza gave every appearance of being deaf to the racket, and the string quintet might have been playing in an enclosed theater before a respectful audience, instead of a noisy open space, being ignored by one and all. Clea stood at the gate, slightly nervous, which gave her some idea of the work her regulators were doing, and wondered at the ability of humans to compartmentalize their attention like that. It should be impossible for such inferior beings to do something so difficult so easily. On the other hand, they provided themselves with endless opportunities to perfect this particular ability. The line moved up, and an usher took her invitation, leaving her free to enter. It seemed to her, as she paused on the edge of the party, that everyone wearing a tie was looking at her, waiters included. Well, she thought, It seems the dress is having the promised effect. The saleswoman had assured her that she would be eye-catching. She looked different tonight. After spending the afternoon at a spa, having every conceivable treatment, she looked dark and glamorous. The makeup artist had almost wept when Clea pulled out the glasses and put them on, and had insisted on making adjustments. The woman's efforts had paid off. Clea looked very little like her progenitor, and the knowledge gave her a confidence that she was often sadly lacking. Clea looked around. It was time to seek her prey. Ron LeBain sipped his champagne and looked around the important, well-dressed people surrounding him. These days, he was invited to every noteworthy event in the city. Usually, he went because it was an opportunity to speak with money. Such opportunities were not to be overlooked. Occasionally, he worried that he was in danger of losing his idealistic purity. Money was dirty after all, and the filth could smear your soul if you weren't careful. Lie down with dogs, you get up with fleas. Ron was about to make some remark to the crowd around him when his eye was caught by a beautiful woman in a painted-on red dress, moving across the plaza with the grace of a stalking panther. He thought she might be looking for someone. I'd like it to be me, he thought. Clea finally spotted Vladimir Hill, surrounded by an admiring cluster of committee women. There was Mrs. Colvin, and by her side was her husband, the CEO of Cyberdyne. She approached the little knot of people with a slight smile that hid her nervousness. Vladimir looked up. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of her, and he smiled his welcome. He began walking toward Clea with a confident gait, almost a swagger. Clea's smile widened. He would be her entree to the group. Vladimir introduced her to each of the committee women, every one of whom noticed her dress. Their husbands did too, but they approved. After the introductions, Hill reclaimed everyone's attention for himself. Clea leaned towards Mrs. Colvin and spoke out of the side of her mouth. I don't know how I let myself get talked into buying this dress, she said. But I'm just a Montana country girl, and that sales lady was a big city shark, if you ever saw one. She said it was what everyone would be wearing, and I'd look a fool if I didn't buy it. Clea gave a little huff and looked around nervously. I think I look like a hussy, she whispered. Mrs. Colvin smiled at her, really smiled for the first time, and leaned close. You look fine. I've met a saleswoman like that a time or two myself, she said. Then she gave Clea's arm a little pat. Trust me, you're coming out of it better than I did. Montana. Crack. The Terminator raised its head, scanning in the visual and infrared. The sound had been a medium-caliber rifle with a 98% probability of being a hunting weapon. It had been fired approximately 1.2 kilometers to the northeast. It turned and walked in that direction, wading through a knee-high stream of glacially cold water, then through an open pine forest. Animals fell silent as they scented its approach. That might alert the humans, and so might the unavoidable crackling of fallen branches under its 500-pound weight. Otherwise, it made little disturbance in the environment as it passed, dipping and bending with eerie grace to avoid the standing vegetation. The two hunters, poachers given that this was out of season, at night and on private property, were stringing the deer up to a branch and preparing to butcher it. They turned with startled speed as the Terminator approached over the last 10 yards. One wrinkled his nose. "Hell, what's that smell, man?" the shorter one said. The Terminator's machine mind drew a wire diagram over them both. The larger human's clothes would be suitable. Its own were saturated with decay products. If they did not see him clearly, there would be no need to arouse potential attention by terminating them. At present, both orders and its own estimation of the proper maximization of mission goals indicated stealth tactics. "You," it said. "Fat man, lay down your weapons, give me your clothes and boots, and then go away. This is private property." The flat gravel of his voice seemed to paralyze both men for an instant. Then the bigger of the two spoke. "What did you say?" "I said, you, fat man, lay down your weapons, give me your clothes and boots, then go away. This is private property." "The hell you say?" The bigger man's accent had a good deal of Western twang, overlaying something else. The Terminator's speech recognition software estimated his birthplace as within 20 kilometers of Newark, New Jersey. "He didn't even say please," the smaller man put in. "Please," the Terminator added. "Mister, your ideas stink worse than you do," the bigger man said, and reached for the angle-headed flashlight at his belt. "Don't turn on that light." "The hell you say?" The light speared out and shone full on the Terminator's face, glittering in the reflective lenses no longer hidden by false flesh, highlighting the shreds of rotten skin hanging from the lips and the white teeth behind. A sharp smell of urine and feces reached the Terminator's chemoreceptors from the smaller man. The bigger man snatched up his rifle, Arms Tech Limited, TTR 700 sniper weapon system, the Terminator's databank listed, and fired. The hollow-point 7.62mm round flattened against one of the pseudo-ribs of the Terminator's thorax and peened off into the darkness. The T-101 stepped forward 3 paces as the poacher struggled to work the bolt of his rifle and snatched it out of his hand, tearing off one finger as it came. A blow with his fist between the eyes disposed of the bigger hunter, and it stooped to pick up a rock for the second, who was fleeing into a blundering rush through the night. The rock left the Terminator's hand at over 100 meters per second, and transformed the back of the smaller man's head to bone fragments and mush. The Terminator appropriated the big man's hunting jacket and hat, as well as his boots. Then it dragged the two corpses deep into the woods for the wild animals to finish off. After a thoughtful pause, it carved a short slogan into their chests with a hunting knife. People for the ethical treatment of animals. Their truck windows were only partially darkened so that the driver could still be seen, but dimly. It found a pair of sunglasses on the dash and put them on, trimmed away the strips dangling from its lips, started the engine, and began to drive. Except for the smell and the band-aid on its nose that hid exposed steel, it could pass for human again, in a dim light, and as long as the human didn't get too close. Big B Diner, Route 85, New Mexico. Waylon Bridges and Luke Hardy sat sipping their cokes and watching the TV mounted over the counter. Conversation was over for the time being, and they were just waiting for their customer. One of their favorite reality programs was on, a show called Crime Fighters. They reenacted actual crimes and then showed pictures of the suspects in hope that people would call in with the whereabouts of these people. Tonight they were showing exclusive footage of a murderous raid on a police station in California. The host grimly warned that this sequence was not suitable for children or very sensitive viewers. Then the blurry tape began to roll, and a huge man in sunglasses, carrying guns in both hands, began murdering cops by the dozen. Waylon and Luke sat with their mouths open and watched the carnage. "My God," Luke murmured. "Damn," Waylon agreed. The camera froze on the man's face. "If you have any information on this man," the host intoned, "call this number or contact this web address." Waylon quickly wrote the numbers down on a napkin. "Love to get my hands on that sucker," he said. Luke lit up a cigarette, blew a speck of tobacco off his lip, and shook his head. "You and me both, brother," he said. "I wonder what they're offering for him." "Enough," Waylon said, slapping the pen on the table. He lit a cigarette off his own and leaned back to watch the show. A kid of about 17 came into the diner and paused inside the doorway, looking around. He spotted the two men and walked over to them. Waylon and Luke pretended not to notice. "Excuse me?" John said. They looked him over thoroughly before one of them condescended to answer. "Yeah," Waylon drawled. "I'm looking to buy a used car," John said. John assumed that these were the men he was supposed to speak to. They were the only two customers in here. The Jeep with the for sale sign in the window was supposed to be the signal that the gun dealers were in. He waited politely for them to make the next move. Waylon and Luke exchanged glances. At length. "I'd forgotten what dealing with good old boys could be like," John thought impatiently. "I guess it's kinda like forgetting pain once it's gone. If you didn't, you'd never go back to the dentist and there would be no second children, as Mom puts it." Not from us, you're not, Luke said, his blue eyes cold. I ain't gonna sell nothing to no kid. I don't want to be responsible for no high school shooting spree. Maybe you'd like to speak to my dad, John suggested. He's out in the car. And he could whoop both of y'all with one hand tied behind his big old back. My God, he thought. I can't believe I thought that. It must be contagious. Luke and Waylon exchanged another meaningful look. Luke turned his eyes to stare at John while Wayland examined his thumbnail closely. Then he looked up at Connor from under his eyebrows. How come your daddy didn't come in here himself? He asked. Ah, come on, John thought. Nobody talks like this. This guy's probably from San Diego. He looked from one man to the other. My daddy is looking at your car, mister, he drawled. Then he spread his hands at hip level. You want to do business or what? They dragged themselves up like they'd been busting broncos all day and adjusted their hats carefully, then sauntered out of the diner. Behind them, John rolled his eyes. They all walked through the reddish dust to the white Ford Dieter had rented. He was leaning over, putting something back into the glove compartment. Von Rossbach straightened up and looked at them, and Luke and Waylon froze. It only lasted an instant, but to men as experienced as John and Dieter, it was the equivalent of a shout. Do I know you? Waylon asked. John gave him a sharp look. He could have sworn there was a slight tremor in the man's voice. No, Dieter said crisply. He got out of the car and the two men stepped back. Von Rossbach leaned against the door and casually crossed his arms over his chest. But we have mutual friends. These friends got names? Luke asked. Dieter mentioned one. The two dealers glanced at each other, and Waylon raised one shoulder in a half shrug. So what do you want? Luke asked. I want Barrett 50 caliber sniper rifles or their equivalent. I want Browning heavy machine guns. I want Carl Gustav or Law or other light anti-armor weapons, plus any military-grade small arms you have on hand, preferably battle rifle caliber. I'll need them shipped all over the US. He added. Waylon tugged down the corners of his mouth and frowned. Gonna be expensive, he cautioned. That there is some heavy shit. For top quality goods, I can live with expensive, Von Rossbach said easily. He pushed himself off the car door and managed to loom over the two men, even though their heights were almost equal. Not getting what I'm paying for? That I couldn't live with. He stared hard at Waylon until the other man broke eye contact, grinning as he looked at his companion. With us, you always get what you pay for. He flicked a hand at Dieter. You think our friend would steer you to a bum deal? Dieter stared at him for a moment, then shook his head. I'll want to see some samples, he told them. so that there are no misunderstandings about what I want. Wayland bit his lip, and the two men looked at each other for a long moment. Then Wayland nodded. "No problem," he said cheerfully. "But we don't carry the stuff with us, naturally." He pulled a map out of his pocket and spread it on the hood of von Rossbach's Ford. "We got us a little out-of-the-way spot where we do our private business." He pointed at a spot marked on the map. "You meet us here tomorrow night at 7 o'clock. You got any questions?" "Can I keep this?" Dieter asked. "Sure thing," Wayland said generously. "I know my way already." He grinned. "Till tomorrow," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Yes," Dieter said. He folded the map and put it in his breast pocket. "Tomorrow." John got in the passenger side of the car and sat watching the two gun dealers as Dieter started up and drove away in a cloud of dust, the plume vanishing into the dry crackling grass and occasional dark green scrub cedar. "Is it my imagination, or was there something wrong about them?" he asked. Dieter grimaced. "Hard to say," he answered. "There's often something off about these people. Maybe to them I still smell like a cop. Holmes wouldn't steer me wrong," he added. "Of that I'm confident." John nodded, then looked out into the desert, frowning. Something still didn't feel right. "Not deliberately," he said. "But Holmes might be wrong. Or something might have spooked those two." "My God," Luke said. "Damn," Wayland agreed, having trouble controlling his gleeful laughter. "That is fucking unbelievable. It was really him." Luke punched his fist in the air. "Yes." Then he looked at his friend. "How are we gonna handle this?" "First, we call that number," Wayland said, heading towards their table. "Oh shit! Hey! Who cleaned off my table?" he shouted. The waitress turned to stare, her mouth wide open. "I wrote something important down on that napkin, Maria. Where is it?" She pursed her lips and pulled the wastebasket from under the counter. "This it?" she asked, pulling up a dirty napkin with a number written on it. "Yeah," Wayland said, snatching it from her fingertips. "What'd you do, barf on it?" Luke pulled his lips back from his teeth in disgust. "Sure looks like it," he muttered. "Hey, bring me some coffee," Wayland shouted as he went back to his table. "Yeah," Luke agreed. Pulling out his cell phone, Wayland dialed the crime fighter's show, started to speak, and then stopped with an exasperated expression. "Lines are busy," he said to Luke. Then, "Yeah, that guy who shot up all them cops. What's the reward for finding him?" His mouth and eyes opened wide. $500,000? Luke punched the air again and again, stamping his feet beneath the table. Wayland cocked his head, listening. "Oh, bless your heart, honey. Don't you worry about me. I'm considered pretty dangerous myself." He listened. "No, ma'am. I won't tell you where I'm calling from, but I will tell you that by tomorrow night, that sucker's gonna be on his way to jail. I guarantee it." He disconnected and grinned at Luke. $500,000, buddy! Woo! Luke shook his head in wonder, then slowly sobered. "Think we should have help?" Wayland made a face. "Bringing somebody else in means less money for you and me," he pointed out. Then he looked thoughtful. "Yeah," he finally said. "Good idea, actually. We'll get Luis, have him waiting out in the desert. Then if anything goes wrong, we're covered. He's one mean little greaser." He nodded. "Yep." Then he grinned again and high-fived his buddy. "Yee-haw!" U.S. Sector Headquarters. "Sir?" The young woman turned from her console towards her superior. "I think I've got something here." The man hurried over. Surveillance was in what sector operatives called the pit, below the slanted glass of the office from which the operatives oversaw HQ. "What you got?" Crime Fighters has received an anonymous phone call from New Mexico inquiring about the reward. He told the operator that he'd have the suspect in custody by tomorrow night. The supervisor frowned and leaned towards her, looking over her head at the screen. "What's his location?" The agent turned to her computer and tapped a few keys. "Route 85. He's at a diner named The Big B," she said. "We have an agent nearby?" She queried the database. "The nearest is in Los Alamos," she said. After a few more taps, she said, "He can be there in an hour." "Good." The supervisor nodded once. "Send him or her now. Even if this guy has left, someone there might know something." Utah. Alyssa smiled, looking positively angelic as she dangled her short legs and feet in their little red shoes off the edge of the too-tall chair. Her hands flew over the computer keyboard in a blur of machine-accurate movement, and the crackle of the keys sounded like distant machine gun fire. The moment she'd heard about this TV program, she'd hacked into their computer and phone system. Then she'd thought better of it and checked out the various government agencies and anti-terrorist groups. Only the sector was listening in. While crime fighters had received the call, the sector had zeroed in on the location of the caller. The tiny I-950 was delighted by her own cleverness. "Sister," she sent to Clea. Clea, who was having a quiet but, she sensed, important conversation with Roger Colvin, barely skipped a beat as she answered her little sister. "Bad timing, Alyssa," she warned. Aloud, she said to Cyberdyne's CEO, "There are all sorts of ways this material can be used. I've thought of several weapons, for example. They'd require some additional research to bring them to manufacture, but they'd be very useful. Alyssa paused, reluctant to interfere with her sister's progress. Her success with Cyberdyne was vital. Still, this would be a very brief report. "We have a lead on von Rossbach," she said. "It's possible he's in New Mexico." "The Black Hawk, did you acquire it?" Clear sent. "And where did you take your degree?" Colvin asked. "It will be delivered tomorrow," Alyssa said. "I can have a team in New Mexico well before tomorrow evening." "I had an unusual upbringing," Clear said to Colvin. "My uncle was a genius and educated me himself, more or less in isolation, in Montana." She shrugged, which did interesting things to her dress. "Consequently, I lack a degree, I'm afraid. But perhaps because of that, I feel I'm more creative than a lot of scientists and engineers who have a hard and fast field or discipline." To Alyssa, she said, "Excellent. Keep me informed. But I want you to stay in Utah. Send no more than 4 Terminators. We need to keep some for backup." "Understood," Alyssa responded. "I'll keep you informed. Out." Alyssa hopped down from the chair, folded her hands under her chin with her shoulders high, and spun in sheer delight, her golden locks floating in the still cool air of the new Utah headquarters. Underground, of course. The area had many abandoned mines. The regulators worked overtime to deprive her of this natural high, and unlike Serena, she resented the interference. She had reason to feel good and wished she could enjoy it. Then she dropped her hands to her sides. It was gone. Her brief celebration was over. "Well, it is more efficient," she thought, and began to plan what weapons the Terminators should take. Big B Diner, New Mexico. An hour and 15 minutes later, a plump, middle-aged man ambled into the diner and took a seat at the counter. He took a menu out of the holder and smiled politely at the waitress, who smiled back. "Coffee?" she asked. "You bet," he said. He'd checked the place out when he walked in. It was deserted except for the help and him. The only cars in the lot probably belonged to the waitress and the cook. The surroundings were bare cow salad bar for miles in every direction. She came back and poured a rich-smelling brew into a white mug. He took a sip and his brows went up. She grinned. "Better than you expected, right?" "Yes, ma'am." She leaned her arms on the counter and got comfortable. "Yeah, we drink it ourselves, so we figure we might as well get the good stuff. Would you like something else? We close in about half an hour," she said apologetically. "How's your apple pie?" "Good," she said, straightening. "Ice cream?" "Please." He turned to look around the deserted restaurant. "You know what?" he said as she placed the pie down before him. "I was asked to come in and talk to some guy who called to report seeing somebody on Crime Fighters." He shook his head. "He would have been here about half an hour ago." She placed an elbow on a napkin holder, rested her head on her fist, and looked at him like she was the tiredest woman in the world. A silent moment passed while the agent took a forkful of pie and ice cream, making a pleased sound. Then a little frown crinkled her forehead. "Yeah," she said, making up her mind. "That'd be Waylon Bridges." Her lips drew back in a sneer. "He made a big deal about this number he'd written down, got real snarky about it." Lifting another forkful of pie, the agent looked at her and asked, "Know where I can find him?" She looked away and shook her head slightly. "No, I don't know where he lives." She chewed her lower lip. Then she looked at him. "But tomorrow, I think I know where he'll be." She told the agent that Bridges thought of himself as a wheeler-dealer who liked to have meetings with shady characters in an out-of-the-way spot down the road. "I saw him talking to somebody in the parking lot earlier, and then they drove off. So that probably means they'll be meeting him there tomorrow night." She shrugged. "I think he thinks it's this big mystery that nobody knows about, but everybody does. He always does the same thing." "How come the cops don't pick him up?" the agent asked. She shrugged. "No law against talking to people in a parking lot or meeting up with them in the desert. Anyway, whatever he's up to, I don't think it's very important, or they would do something." "Could you draw me a map?" the agent asked. "Sure." She shrugged again, but looked a bit unhappy. "You won't tell him I told you?" He grinned. "It won't even come up," he assured her. "But even if he asks, I won't say." She grinned too, and began to draw. Serve Bridges right for being such a cheap, snarky bastard. Dud tippers never had any luck. Not if she had something to say about it. New York. "An organic whole," the sculptor proclaimed. "And so I've named it Venus Dancing, because with every passing day it will change, never remaining the same from sunrise to sunset." The audience applauded politely as Hill tugged on a cord and the silky covering slid aside to reveal a gleaming silver object over 15 feet tall on its contrasting pedestal of bronze. The pedestal was also a circular bench, molded in such a way that it seemed to flow into the different color of the sculpture itself. Venus Dancing was triangular in shape and pierced here and there on its surface with round holes of various sizes. Loops of the silvery substance flowed away from the sides of the sculpture in a way that suggested vibrations. As the members of the audience watched, the material, now freed from its protective shroud, reacted to the cooler air, changing shape, changing texture to become sharper edged, the loops more angular. The crowd oohed its approval and moved closer. The heat of their bodies softened the outlines of the lower half of Venus dancing, bringing forth spontaneous applause. Clea, looking on and applauding with the rest, suddenly found a business card in front of her face. Startled, she turned to find Roger Colvin giving her a very serious look. "Call me," he said. "I think we've got a lot to discuss." She took the card and smiled. "I'll do that," she promised.